Before I get into differentiation, I will make other comments about monotone functions, which will be useful when we do differentiation. Suppose R, we say F is monotone, strictly increasing, non-decreasing, strictly decreasing. If x1 less than x2, of course all are in the interval AB, our interest is in AB, implies fx1 is strictly less than fx2, non-decreasing means fx1 is less than or equal to fx2, and decreasing means fx1 greater than fx2. His name is such as itself. There is nothing very special about this. Okay, now we are going to make one or two comments about the monotone non-decreasing functions or non-increasing. So suppose whatever I say for non-decreasing, a corresponding statement will be valid for non-increasing. Take minus f. If f is not decreasing, minus f will be non-increasing. So if you have a non-increasing function, look at minus f, apply the theorem for non-decreasing function, get back to this. So there is a simple dual. Okay, suppose f mapping A to B, A B to R is non-decreasing. Now let's take any point x naught in AB. Okay. So I have this situation. This is A and B. I am looking at x naught. Alright, now let's take for some delta positive, look at x naught minus delta x naught. First this interval. Take this interval. Look at it for any y. I don't even need that. Any, doesn't matter. For any y, I could have taken delta as what? All the way up to A also. Anyway, for any y in x naught minus delta, certainly fy is less than or equal to fx naught. That's simply because it is non-decreasing. So I did not even need that x naught minus delta. I could have taken any y to the left of x naught, that it is true. Okay. So I can as well make it, but I make it finally closer to x naught. So let me put it this way. For any y less than x naught. Of course, within that interval, otherwise it doesn't. So fy is less than fx, less than or equal to fx naught because non-decreasing. Okay, and therefore, if I now look at all these y's, look at all the if I look at all the fy's, y less than x naught. This is a set of numbers. For every point I calculate what the value of f is and I get a set of numbers. So this set of numbers, so consider A. S naught is a set of numbers, real numbers, and it is bounded above by fx naught, and it is bounded above fx naught. But we know that any set of numbers which is bounded above has a least upper bound. Every bounded set of real numbers has a least upper bound. So let A, L, be the least upper bound of this set S naught. Set of all this. So every bounded set, every set bounded above has a least upper bound. Now our claim is that this L is exactly equal to that is the left hand limit. What we are claiming is that left hand limit exists and is exactly equal to this least upper bound. So why do we do that? So first of all, reason, since L is the least upper bound for the set S. Now here is L. If we take any epsilon positive and look at L minus epsilon, take any epsilon and look at L minus epsilon, what will happen? This cannot be an upper bound, because this is the least upper bound. Therefore, there must be somebody from there sitting here. There exists an S from S naught such that S naught is greater than L minus epsilon. Right. Therefore, what is meant by there exists an S? The S's come from S naught. If S's come from S naught, it must be of the form f of y for some y. Okay. Therefore, there exists a y naught less than x naught such that, let me call it S naught, such that S naught equal to f y naught is less than L minus epsilon. So there is a y naught such that f of y naught is less than this least upper bound minus epsilon. Is that clear? So A is the least up, L is the least upper bound. So therefore, to the left of, if you move to the left of it, somebody from that set must come. Anybody in that set is of the form f of y. So some f of y naught must be less than L minus epsilon. So if f of y naught is less than L minus epsilon,
Greater than, sir.
greater than L minus epsilon. Now if f of y naught is greater than L minus epsilon, if I go to the right of y naught and look at any other y, f of y will be greater than f of y naught, and therefore that will also be. So therefore, for any y such that y naught less than y less than x naught, we have f of y is greater than okay, so any y greater than the thing, that will be in L minus epsilon. Therefore, what it says is, therefore, for every y, f of y lies in the interval L minus epsilon. What are they trying to do? What is the left hand limit? For it is there. I mean, I am just trying to write it how it is. So for every y, it is in that limit. Okay, that's therefore limit is, what do I say? For any given epsilon, I can make all of them lie in L minus epsilon L beyond a certain stage. That stage is that y naught stage. So beyond a certain stage, all the values lie in L minus epsilon L, and therefore I can do it for every L. Therefore, as y tends to x naught, it will be L. But what is this limit? This is precisely fx minus. So what this really says is the left hand limit must exist, and it must be equal to this least upper bound. Similarly, the right hand limit will exist and it will be equal to the greatest lower. So the important thing is therefore fx naught minus and fx naught plus exist at all points in AB. Why did I write open interval AB? Because at the end points, here I can talk only about the left limit, here I can talk only about the right limit because the function is not defined elsewhere. In the interior, it is defined only at the left and right limit, and at A, fx naught, fa plus is defined, and at B, fa b minus is defined. So what this really says is that a monotone function will have both left and right limits. And what can I say about the left hand limits? I am coming from this side, right hand limits are coming from that side, all those values are greater than all these values, so the right hand limit will be always bigger than the left hand limit. So this is again a clearly business. Fx naught plus minus is less than or equal to fx naught is less than or equal to fx naught plus for every x naught. The left hand limit, all these fellows are smaller than x naught, therefore in the limit there will be less than or equal to fx naught. On the right hand side, all these fellows are greater than fx naught, and therefore the limit will be also be greater than. So basically, therefore, for a monotone function, both left hand and right hand limits exist at every interior point. And therefore, the only way that there could be a discontinuity is the left hand limit doesn't match with the the value, or the right hand limit does not match with the value, or both do not match with the value. Therefore, at least one of the values should not match with fx naught. So the type of discontinuity that a monotone function can have is only jump type of discontinuity. Okay. Therefore, f can have only jump type of discontinuity. Now this we said for monotone non-decreasing. For monotone non-increasing, the same you apply for minus f. Minus f can have only jump type, therefore f can also have only jump type, nothing greater. So the first conclusion is that suppose F mapping A to B is monotone, then the only, this is the first result, the only type of discontinuity you can have is jump type. Okay. Now again, suppose F is not decreasing. One thing is very clear. If both fx naught minus and fx naught plus are equal, they will have to be equal to fx naught and force continuity. So therefore, for discontinuity, what should I have? One of them will have to be higher. The fx naught and fx naught minus and fx naught plus cannot be equal. If you have a discontinuity point, then the fx naught minus and fx naught plus cannot be equal. Okay. So at a discontinuity point, fx naught plus is not equal to fx naught. Because if it were, it will also be equal to fx naught and you will get continuity. So what it therefore has is, either the function is continuous, it cannot have a removable discontinuity. What is a removable discontinuity? Both left and right limits coincide. I can redefine the function to be that common value and make it continuous. Now there is no way, now we are going to redefine the function at x naught and make it continuous. So there is no removable discontinuity, it's a strict jump type discontinuity. And so, you cannot have removable discontinuity. Yeah.
Let's make it clear, removable discontinuity.
So suppose I have a function like this. From the left it converges to this, from the right it converges to this, but the value of the function at that point was that. Okay? So I can redefine the value to be that at this point and the new function will be continuous. That is what is removed. I removed it by modifying the value of the function just at that one single point. That you cannot do for a monotone function because the left and right limit will never coincide. If they coincide, it become a point of continuity. But I am talking about a point of discontinuity. Okay, therefore...
Sir, there can be many discontinuities.
Pardon me?
Can there be many discontinuities?
Can there be?
More than one discontinuity.
At every point of discontinuity, at any point of discontinuity, if the left and the right derivatives are equal, if at any point for a monotone function, the left and right limits are equal, they must be equal to the value of that function. Okay. So the only way discontinuity for a monotone function can happen at a point is that the left and the right derivatives are not equal. See, how many ways discontinuity can take place? One, the left limit does not exist. In that case, there is no question of continuity at all. Or the right limit does not exist. In that case, again, there is no question of continuity at all. Or the left limit and the right limit exist, but they are not equal. That is another type of continuity. The fourth type is the left and right exist, they are equal, but they are not equal to the value of the function. Now what monotone function is, it says first type is not allowed, left limit has to exist. The second type not allowed, right limit has to exist. The third type not allowed, left and right exist equal but not equal to the value. The only type of discontinuity is left exists, right exists, and those two are not equal. That's what I'm trying to say. Was that clear? So okay, let me explicitly write. Thus, x naught is a point of discontinuity. X naught belonging to AB. At the other points, only the right type will come. X naught is a point of discontinuity if and only if, but this is for a monotone function. X naught is a point of discontinuity if and only if f naught x, fx naught plus, fx naught minus exist, and they should not be equal, so there should be, this must be strictly less than this. They should not be equal, but then this order must be maintained, and therefore fx naught minus must be strictly less than fx naught plus. That is the important observation. So among the various types of discontinuities that are possible, a monotone function allows only one type, namely the left limit exists and is strictly less than the right limit, which is also existing. That is the only type of discontinuity for a monotone function. Okay. So that is that being the first observation. The next we observe is the following. So, suppose DF is the set of discontinuities of a monotone function. Okay. Then for every x naught belonging to DF, I will again make some comments in a very loose manner. I think everything very difficult. For every x naught belonging to DF, we have fx naught minus is less than fx naught plus. And therefore, between any two real numbers, there is a rational number. Between any two real numbers, there is a rational number. So there exists a rational number Rx naught such that fx naught minus less than fx naught minus is a real number, fx naught plus is a real number. These two are not equal, so there are 2 points. But between any two numbers, there is a rational number. So that will depend on x naught, of course. So corresponding to every such discontinuity, I have found a rational number. Now I want to make one comment. Suppose is there a question about this?
Rx naught.
Rx naught less than.
Oh, there is Rx naught is missing, right? Okay. So what is saying is, I come from the left, x naught, I come from the left, I come from the right, there is a jump. In that jump, between these 2 points, there is a Rx naught. That is what I am trying to pick up. Between the 2 jumps, there is a rational number. Look at those 2 heights. Irrespective of whether the heights are rational, irrational or not, between those 2 heights, there is a rational height. That's all. That is what I am calling as Rx naught. So, therefore, corresponding to every discontinuity point, I have a rational number. Now, suppose x naught and x1 are any 2 discontinuities, any 2 points in DF. Suppose there are 2 discontinuity points. Then I will have an Rx naught associated with x naught and an Rx1 associated with x1. I will assert that if x naught is not equal to x1, Rx naught will not be equal to Rx. So let's see. First of all, without and x naught not equal to x1. So let me, without loss of generality, assume that x naught is less than. If the two real numbers
So this
are
means
not,
that there are at most countably infinite discontinuities.
that's
in the
what
model.
that's okay. That's exactly what I'm going to say. So we have two real numbers which are not equal, then either they are less than or greater than. So suppose let's take this case. Here is x naught. Here is x naught. So now it's very clear the curves will be something like this. Fx1 minus this is what would happen to the limits that you look at. The plus limit of this will always be less than or equal to the negative limit of this because the curve is increasing. So that's the thing that I said. I will just write it by picture and tell you. And therefore f x naught plus is less than or equal to fxn minus, which is strictly less than fx1 plus. This is rx naught. This is there is a okay, that's the string we will get. So therefore it says Rx naught will be strictly less than Rx. So Rx naught will be strictly less than Rx. So what it therefore says is, with every distinct, with every set of, every point of discontinuity, I have associated a distinct rational numbers. Okay? Therefore, what did I call? Df is equivalent to a subset of Q. Take all these fellows and then there is a one-to-one correspondence between these discontinuities in Q, and therefore the cardinality of Df is either finite or countable. Hence, a monotone function can have at most countably infinite discontinuity. That is what I want. So that's the theorem. Theorem is a monotone function can have at most countably infinite discontinuities. So we have shown that only jump type is possible, and even that can be at most, so either finite or countably infinite is possible. Now it's a good question. Given any countably infinite set, you can always construct a monotone function which has this as discontinuities. Given, I'll just indicate, given any countably infinite set. Let me write that first. There exists a monotone. Well, if you want non-decreasing, you can have non-decreasing. If you want non-increasing, because you can take the minus of it. Non-decreasing function. Yeah. Infinite subset A of AB. There exists a monotone non-decreasing function f on AB such that precisely at those points it is discontinuous. Exactly for any countably infinite set you can construct a monotone non-decreasing function. Now you must be very careful in asserting this. How would you go about proving this? Some intuitive idea first.
We will create jumps at all
Huh?
How much jump will you create?
You to choose whatever jump.
But suppose if I take a rational number 6.
The problem is how these points are distributed. Suppose they are distributed in a discrete manner, then I will put one jump, then go to the next jump and all. But suppose these fellows are densely distributed, then there is a problem of even arranging them, okay, in a decreasing or increasing order. So the problem becomes complex because that countably infinite set can be very badly, very too closely distributed, in the sense it could be dense also. Okay. So A could be dense also, whatever it is. If A is finite, no problem. Okay. Just keep constant up to the first one, then make a jump, whatever jump, then keep constant, then you go to the next fellow and then jump. That's not a problem. If at least, if A is also a discretely distributed sequence, starting with the lowest one or upper one, then you can start like this and go on doing it. Give 1 over 2 to the n or whatever jump you want, depending on what you want to do. But then, if they are densely distributed, you will be in problem. Okay, so A could be a dense set. So I'll just give you a function which does this job. Some verifications I will leave it to you. Okay. So A is dense. A is countably infinite. If A is finite, there is nothing to prove. It's a trivial statement. So A is countably infinite. So some way you can arrange them as a sequence. That's all I know. So let A equal to an equal to 1 to infinity with some arrangement of df minus of df as a sequence. Now, it looks like we will see why it is that alpha n is any non-negative sequence such that I am assuming some things about series is convergent. Take any sequence of alpha n such that summation of this. For example, you can take alpha n to be 1 over 2 to the power of n. You know that the geometric series converges. So if you have a problem, take alpha n to be 1 over 2 to the power of n, which is very easy. So, this alpha n has been deliberately chosen. I thought of writing 1 over 2 to n, but because he talked about the jump, I decided to put alpha n. Then, I have not yet defined the function. Define, because this is all in AB. Okay, there is an interval AB in which you are working. Define f mapping AB to R as f of x. There is x. You go and look at all those fellows from this set who are to the left of x, okay, and pick up the corresponding alphas and sum them. So how do I write? Summation alpha n over all n such that alpha an is strictly less than. Take all those ANs. If an AN is to the left of x, I put the corresponding alpha n term. If A100 is here, I put alpha 100. If A100 is not there, alpha 100 term is not there. That could be an infinite sum. It could be an empty sum also. Because everybody may be to the right of x. I don't know where these ANs are sitting. Okay, all the ANs may be sitting to the right of x. If it's an empty sum, I call it a 0. No term is there. So it may have a 0 or one term or many terms or an infinitely many terms. Nevertheless, that series is always convergent because it is dominated by the original series which is convergent. So therefore this is always finite. All the alpha n's, and therefore it's a well-defined function. It associates a real number with each x. No, it does not. I am going to make a set of things which some observations. At least try to argue it intuitively once you know what it is. One, f is monotone. Why? Obvious, because if I take another y, I would have taken all these alpha n that are with x. Maybe there is some more alpha n, a n's which lie between x and y, so I will be throwing more positive terms in that sum, so it will become. So that's very obvious. It's monotone, non-decreasing. Two, limit at every x, limit extending to every x naught exists, that is fx naught minus exists, and equally equal to fx. So it's left continuous in fact. It's going to be left continuous. So there is going to be a jump. So it's not going to be right continuous. So this fx naught plus is going to be slightly higher. And therefore, of course, if it's monotone non-decreasing, we know that fx naught minus fx naught plus exists. Fx naught plus minus 1, 2, fx naught plus minus fx naught is equal to 0. X naught does not belong to the set E. Which means, I will write it here. I can write fx naught or fx naught minus, both are same because they are equal. Okay. So the jump is 0 if x naught does not belong to A. What does that mean? It must be a point of continuity. The function must be continuous because the only type of discontinuity is jump. There is no jump, therefore it must be a point of continuity. So at all points outside A, it is continuous. Okay. So therefore, f is continuous at all x naught. And 3 fak plus minus fak minus. Because now the only worry is what about the jump at the other point? Again I can write fak minus as fak. It doesn't matter because I know that the left limit exists and exactly equal to the value of the function at that point. And this is precisely those alpha case. You said what jump should I give? You could choose arbitrary jumps as long as the total sum is finite. You can make the jump to be any arbitrary alpha case. As long as I choose alpha 1, alpha 2, alpha k in such a way that the sum is finite, I could give that jump there. Okay. So, and therefore f is discontinuous at all ak belonging to A and the jump at this point. Therefore df. So given, but not only I made df is equal to A, I made that I have the left discontinuity and I have the jump to be whatever number I wanted to choose, alpha k, all kinds of crazy things I can do. Right. So therefore, it's not only the fact that the monotone function will have at most countably infinite discontinuities, but given any countably infinite set, you can always construct a monotone function which has discontinuities precisely at these points. This is the point that which I wanted to make. This will be useful as we go along later when we discuss derivatives. Now I come to something. So let me. So what is the main theorem therefore? even a monotone function can have only some type of discontinuities, and consequently it can have at most countably infinite number of discontinuities, and given any countably infinite set, there is a monotone function which has this set of discontinuities. So these are some of the important points as far as the continuity part of monotone function is concerned. Then we look at the derivative parts of the monotone later, once we discuss derivative.
So if DF is dense, this will not be a constructive proof, isn't it?
Well, in a sense, it's a constructive proof. I have said what fx is.
But
It's difficult to sum. It is difficult to sum, definitely. Yeah. But I have shown that there exists. I never say that I will construct enough. Okay. This is only to show that whatever you found is exactly the correct optimal thing. Countable infinite, for every countable infinite set there will be something. So nothing more than that will happen for monotone.
No, but this is an exact construction.
Yeah, but then to sum this is a big problem. We don't know which are all the alpha n's. There is a huge collection of alpha n's.
But we can always get some alpha for any dense set so that we can.
Is it again?
Can we not get any particular set of alpha for a dense set?
I didn't get your question.
Means we will get some alpha n, isn't it?
No, I have chosen alpha n arbitrarily. As long as the sum of the alpha n's is finite, you can give that jump there. So the choice is in your hands. The jump is in your hands. You choose. You give me this infinite set. Then I decide. Okay, I will give a jump of alpha 1 at a1, alpha 2 at a2, alpha 3 at a3, and alpha n at an. And then I'll give it. So actually, I am dictating that I can do anything I want as long as the sum of alpha n is finite. That's all. Okay, so I have a lot of freedom in my hand about the jump. The only constraint is the total jump should be finite. Okay, you can see that there is this question of this total jumps, etc., will come in differentiation theory, variation, bounded variation, and all these questions come.
Here, why the right view doesn't exist?
Why? Why it is not? That's what I am trying. I said I am going to write three properties. You think about it for a while. Now you can see. Okay, let me just intuitively tell you. Okay. Here is AK. Now we take a point Y. Right? Now in all this, alpha k will be included. In all this, that term alpha k will be included in the summation. Okay? So therefore, that term will survive as y comes towards ak. Whereas when you come from the left, precisely that term is not included, because I was summing over all those ANs which are less than AK. So that AK fellow singles himself out separately and comes out as the jump. That's the intuitive part. Now we write down the whole thing in epsilon delta. Intuitively what it says is, when I come from the right, this term corresponding to this will keep on surviving as an extra for Y, but when I reach AK it will disappear. Okay, that's the intuitive argument, but the rest of it now you have to write. Alright, so that's the, well, in a sense it is a constructive thing, but then if you say, you tell me you sum all right, you take alpha n is equal to 1 over 2 to n and tell me what is the value of f at square root of 2, then that's going to be a big mess. There are plenty of such constructions in analysis, which are very, very clever constructions. Right, so now I am going to very quickly go through some very simple things that we know about differentiation. So now next chapter is, I will very quickly wind up differentiation. The simple classical things about differentiation, everything is classical only. But the simple things about differential equation, I'll come back to it later. Okay. Come back to more about differentiation a little later, but I will develop a little more sophisticated ideas. First thing is, again, suppose I have and say f is differentiable at m belong to AB. Fx plus h minus fx by h plus h which exists. Then this value and this limit is called, called the derivative of f at x and is denoted by f prime x. Now already here you can do two things. One, you can talk about left derivative and the right derivative. That h can come from the left side or h can go to 0 from the right side. So there is a left derivative and right derivative questions, etc. So let us stick to this part. So therefore, if f is differentiable at x, f prime x is equal to limit h tending to 0 of x plus h. Now what this says is the following. Even after dividing this by h, it goes to some limit. Okay. So if I did not have it, what will happen?
It is of the order h.
So it will go to 0, which means it will be continuous. So very quickly you see that is how we can write. So therefore, it says that if you have differentiability at a point, you will also have continuity at that point. So differentiability of x is continuous. Now I am going to slightly digress, so that this will be later useful. Okay. Now what does this mean? Okay. So what does this mean? Suddenly decided to digress. Okay. So what does this mean to say that this limit is equal to this? Says give me any epsilon positive. There is a neighborhood of or a small edge such that in that h neighborhood that difference minus f prime x is less than epsilon. So what it says is given epsilon positive, there exists a delta positive such that mod h less than delta implies fx plus h minus fx divided by h minus f prime x tends to is what is the dimension? But let me even put it this way. What can I say about this? That is made equal to 0, which means
X plus h. So.
which means if you look at this, it can be made to lie between some two numbers minus epsilon and plus epsilon, right, for mod h less than. If you are close enough, if the error is, if the increment is small enough, then the difference will be can be made. Now look at this. What does that really say? That says fx plus h, suppose I call this as some EH, what EFH. What does that say about EFH? Again, EFH goes to 0. This means I can write fx plus h minus fx is equal to h times f prime x plus h time e of h, where e f h tends to 0 as h tends to 0. Without even this fellow's support, he goes to 0. Now I am going to look at this as the following. This is the change in the value of the function as I change the variable from x to x plus h. So that change in the function can be written as a linear part, because the linear part in the change in the variable, the prime x is a fixed number, I have fixed a point x. So a linear part, something into h, plus something which goes to 0 even when divided by h. The remaining part goes to 0 even when it divided by h. So fx plus h, suppose I call fx plus h minus fx as some delta f, then delta f is equal to linear. What do I mean by linear? It's a line. If I plot it as a function of h, it's a line, but it's a line passing through the origin because it is of the form k times h. So when I say it is linear, I mean linear, that is, I will call it as LH. Which is LH plus K is LH plus LK, and L alpha H is alpha LH. This is what I mean, the linear. As a function of H is a linear function of H, is a transformation, is a linear transformation. It preserves superposition. Plus some EH where limit h tending to 0 of EH equal to 0. Okay, that is how I look at the derivative. So I say that the function is differentiable at a point x if the increment in the function can be written as a linear function of the increment in the variable for something, but plus something which goes to, this is EH by something which goes to 0 of a order higher than h. Even when you divide it out by h, it still goes to 0. That's what the. Now this is the way to look at derivative. This is the one that will be generalized to the utmost, because there is the linearity and the rest of it is obvious. Now suppose I have a function from n dimension to n dimension. That is, it takes an n variable function, n variable into an m variable. What does it do? It takes a vector here and maps it to what? f1 of x1, x2, xn, and f2 of x1, xn, fm of x1, x2, xn. The image will have m components, and the components will depend on what variable you started with. So it is an m variable function of an n variable. Or if you take this to be just r, what will that do? Suppose if you take Rm to R, then what will happen? It will take x1, x2, xm and give you one number. So it will be a function of m variables. It's a simple real valued function of m variables. Now when I take Rm to Rn, I am taking n real valued functions of m variables. That's what the map is. Now suppose such a fellow is there, I will write it in compact notation as the vector x, I will treat it as a vector x now, is mapped to another vector x. Okay. This vector has n components and that vector has m components. This vector has m component, that vector has n components. That is the situation we have. How do you define the different derivative of such a fellow? How can I define a function is differentiable at a point? Where? At a point in Rn. So here is Rn. Here is a vector in Rn. Here is a vector in Rm. This fellow is mapped to this vector. And that has m component, it has n components. Now, I want to talk about whether the function is differentiable at this point x bar. That's not at all difficult. What I will do is now, I have to give an increment to the variable x. What sort of increment? The x itself is a vector. So my increments will have to be vector increments of the same size so that I can add x plus h. So let h be also a vector in, what did I call this domain, Rn or Rm? Suppose I have this x bar in Rn, h bar in Rn, then look at right? That is the increment that I am having. I must be able to write that increment as a linear transformation of the increment variable. What are linear transformations in Rn? There are matrices. So therefore I must have a matrix, or at least L of h bar, which is a linear transformation, plus something then depends on h bar, which is such that, now I can't say I will divide that vector by this vector. So whenever I cannot, I want to quantify, I will put the norm such that limit non h bar tending to 0 or non e h bar divided by non h bar 0 to 0. Okay. That's what the, so then we say that f is and this L must be called a derivative. That L will be now an m by n matrix. So the derivative of a m to n function, n to m function is an m by n matrix. And that will give you the Jacobian, all those partial derivatives. The ijth entry, if things are nice, the ijth entry will be the delta squared f by delta xi, delta squared fi by delta xi, all those things. I will not write all those things. Delta fi by delta xi. The main idea is the linearity. That the derivative, the difference, the increment in the function is a linear function in the increment of the variable plus something that goes to 0 at a good rate. That's what the idea is.
When we expect that limit x goes to 0, that would be valid for each component of epsilon, that e.
Now at a point x, we say that f is differentiable at x bar. What is your question?
No, this epsilon is a vector, isn't it?
This epsilon is also a vector.
So shouldn't each component of that vector go to 0 as h goes to 0?
Not each component of that vector divided by the norm of the increment. Still Each component going to 0 is not a big deal. What I want it to go to 0 at a faster rate than I want, even after dividing by the norm of h, it still goes to 0.
Okay,
So what you want to say is each component modulus divided. See, after all, what did I say? In finite dimension, it all boils down to coordinate wise convergence. Okay, and that's what you say. Everything in finite dimension can be reduced to coordinate wise convergence. But if infinite dimensions, you have to write it this way. You can't. So now this definition doesn't have anything to do with Rn or Rm. You can take a mapping from one nonlinear space to another nonlinear space and say that it is differentiable at a point x. If there is a linear, bounded linear, there you have to add an additional condition, not linear but also bounded. The topology also should be maintained. A bounded linear transformation L such that this happens. This they call, I don't know, what do they call it? Kato derivative or Frechet derivative or something. Some name is there. Okay. If it is in Banach spaces, it has one name. If it is in Hilbert spaces, it has another name. But anyway, this is the idea that they generalized. And then worked out all the analysis, calculus part, okay, copied one by one, Taylor expansion, etc. etc. Most of the things that we would do with derivatives. Okay. Okay.
Sir, a bounded linear transformation. So, I mean, the linear transformation is at 0, it should be 0.
Yes.
So, if I go a little bit,
It will be little bit. Change will be little bit, that's all. Little changes bring in little changes.
But where this unbounded linear transformation?
Ah. They are difficult to construct, but there are many. Differentiation, for example, in the space of all polynomials, it's an unbounded transformation. Because every time you differentiate, you pick up an n. So the norm goes on increasing. That's the hint you work out, try to work out. When I come, if at all we are still alive and when the time we discuss more on functional analysis, these things will come up again. Okay. So, you have to, some of these things that we state, which will allow for later generalization, I will mention how you should interpret. So, derivative has to be one way is to interpret this. So, basically, it says things can be approximated linearly, and the rest we are very close to that point, and the remaining part is sufficiently small, okay, goes to 0. The error goes to 0 first. Okay. Now, of course, I don't have to say that if two functions are differentiable, the sum is differentiable, the difference is differentiable, scalar multiple is differentiable, product is differentiable. All these things are standard because these properties are true for limits. If limit exists for two fellows, the sum of them are the limits, and the whole definition is in terms of the limits, and therefore automatically everything will be true. So once I have these results for limits, all these carry. And of course, certain things like what is the product rule, etc., you would have already seen the proof, so I will not do the standard rules of differentiation, the derivative of the sum with sum of the derivative, product fg prime plus g prime f, gf prime. The only thing you have to worry about is the f by g. You have to do a little bit careful because the denominator there is there, you make sure it doesn't vanish, etc., etc. Okay, then there are two important theorems which I will straight away jump to. Okay, so maybe I should first make one comment. Suppose I have a function from A to B R and it is continuous and what do we know when you have such a function? We know certainly that it has a maximum, it has a minimum, everything, because I have a closed bounded interval. I say, suppose the point x naught is in the open interval inside is said to be a local maximum for f if, here is the point x naught, there is a small neighborhood of that point such that here is fx naught, the function will not in that neighborhood will stay below that. Okay, what does that mean? This means there exists a delta positive such that y belongs to x naught minus delta, x naught plus delta implies f of y less than or equal to, what did I call it? X naught. So in the neighborhood of that point, locally is the dada, that's all. The local dada. Nobody can beat it. If it goes somewhere, somebody else may beat it. That's what is meant. Similarly, local min. Just inequality reversal. The local min is the reversal. Now suppose x naught is a local max. Okay. Then look at this interval. If we now take any h, x naught plus h here, x naught, let's call it as y. Suppose you look at fy minus fx naught divided by y minus x naught. Fy minus fx naught divided by y minus x naught. What can I say about this?
It is negative.
This fellow will be smaller than him, but this fellow is also smaller than him. Therefore, it will be greater than or equal to 0. Y is less than x naught, so y minus x naught is negative, and fy minus fx naught is also negative because x naught is a local max. So therefore, fy minus fx naught by y minus x naught is less than or equal to 0. Greater than or equal to 0. Suppose this limit exists. When will this limit exist as y tends to x naught? Precisely if f is differentiable at x. So if f is differentiable at x naught, then limit f prime x naught is the same as the left derivative y tending to x naught of fy minus fx naught divided by y minus x naught, y belonging to x naught minus delta to x naught. So I am approaching x naught from the left of x naught, but the limit exists, it doesn't matter from which side you approach because the derivative exists, and therefore this must be greater than or equal to 0 because all these fellows are greater than or equal to 0, so the limit will be greater than. So therefore it says f prime x naught must be greater than or equal to 0. Similarly, look at the other side. If you look at limit y tending to x naught, y belonging to x naught plus delta, x naught plus delta, fy minus fx naught divided by y minus x naught, which is equal to f prime x naught again. Now what can I tell about this ratio?
It should be negative.
This is negative, so this whole thing is less than or equal to 0. Therefore, f prime x naught is greater than or equal to 0 and less than or equal to 0, therefore f prime x naught is equal to 0. This is the first fundamental result. If a function has a local max at x naught and it is differentiable at x naught, then the derivative must be equal to 0. This does not say if the derivative is 0, it's a local max. It only says if it were a local max, it will be 0. So therefore, f has local max at x naught and f differentiable at x naught implies f prime x naught. I am not saying this way. I am saying this way. Right. So this is one of the first results. Now I am going to make at least take two important results. First one is called Rolle's theorem. graphically, what it says is, suppose I have A, B, and then I have a continuous function, it wanders off and then comes back to the same height. In other words, you think of an insect moving at time starting from time t equal to a, and I hope the insect doesn't jump, it crawls, okay? So that it's a continuous motion. Then after when the time t equal to b, it has come back to its original place. Okay, essentially what f of this height is simply the position at time t. So he started out of f of a, went to various places and he eventually came back to same place. If he did that, somewhere along the line he has to stop and then turn back, isn't it? Which means he had stopped, its velocity should have been 0. That means f prime must have become 0. So that's what Rolle's theorem is, that it indeed happens. So what Rolle's theorem is, if f mapping A, if f is continuous in AB, derivative and differentiable in open interval, we will see why that's enough, and it started and ended at the same point, all this implies there exists a C in the integral AB such that f prime C equals 0. In other words, the tangent must have become flat at some point, which is geometrical. Dynamics is that the velocity must have become 0 at some point. This is a very important fundamental result, Rolle's theorem. Okay, I will indicate the proof later. But suppose that insect did not return to the same place, then what happens is the following. I will prove these things later, I will just indicate. Suppose it is A, B, and the insect started here and then ended up there. They are not equal. Then what I do is, the pneumonia case, I will bring it to that equal case. I will create another insect which moves and in such a way that it becomes. So what happens is, suppose can find gx continuous and differentiable, same conditions, such that g of a equal to f of a and g of b equal to f of b. Then look at phi x equal to fx minus gx. What happened? Phi of a is 0, phi of b is 0. I brought that new insect phi to obey my law. Okay, then phi satisfies Rolle's theorem. And therefore there exists a C such that phi prime C is equal to 0. That is f prime C minus g prime C, or f prime C is equal to g prime C. Okay. Now different g's you adjust will give you different generalizations of Rolle's theorem. Now one g I know which does definitely is, you take the straight line. You should start from here and it should go there. So take the straight line graph. So what is that equation? So I can take gx to be equal to the y coordinate difference divided by the x coordinate difference. This is the slope and it passes through f of b plus x. It passes through the point b of b. So slope is known, the point is known, so I read this. So it says f prime c must be, this g satisfies all these conditions. So there must be a c so that f prime c is equal to g prime c. But what is g prime x, g prime c? The derivative of this is 0, this is a constant, because it's a straight line, the derivative is just the slope at all these points. So f g prime c will be equal to f of b minus f. Therefore, there will be some point where I will have f of b minus f of b minus. What this says is, there will be a point where the tangent will be parallel to this chord joining the initial and the final points. But if you change g, you get different theorems, you get different types of, this is called the simple mean value theorem. This is, they don't call it simple mean value, they call it mean value theorem. But varying the g's, you can make it. So the idea is, if you pull that curve in such a way that you get to Rolle's theorem. So Rolle's theorem is a fundamental theorem. From that, everything else is follows. If a fellow is going from one place to another and returns to the same place, somewhere he has to stop and turn. Then his velocity becomes 0. And that's what Rolle's theorem is. And essentially, the rest of it is just going on doing it again and again and again and get the various mean value. Lagrange's mean value theorem, second order, third order, first mean value theorem, second mean value theorem, and then the third student comes, he writes a thesis on third mean value theorem, fourth student comes, fourth mean value theorem. Then Taylor came and said, let's stop this nonsense, he gave a Taylor's theorem. Okay. That's all. Lagrange's first paper was Lagrange's first mean value theorem, then Lagrange's second mean value theorem, and then Taylor said, come on, stop it, and said Taylor's theorem. Okay, so that is the main thing. I will continue in the next class. I will look at this and just indicate the proof of Rolle's theorem and mean value theorem. Then we'll quickly wind up differentiation, and maybe I look at the some of the